Or feel like performance reviews are, well, a little, I don't know, soul-crushing. Today, we're diving into something that promises to make them actually mean something. CIMSuite PAD. We've got a whole stack of materials here, and we're going to unpack how this system works and, more importantly, I think, why you should care.
Yeah, and it's not just about, the nuts and bolts of it all. We're going to really dig into the philosophy behind it, how SimSuite Pad goes beyond just ratings to actually connect your own personal growth with the organization's success.
Okay, so CIMSuite PAD, what is it?
So at its core, SimSuite Pad, it's a structured, collaborative approach to performance management. And it's designed to be used by all staff, not just, certain departments, but in all types of organizations, really.
That's interesting. A lot of the systems that I've seen in the past have been very top-down. It's the managers evaluating their team. This sounds different.
It is. SimSuite Pad emphasizes the shared responsibility for performance. It's about everyone in the organization understanding how their work contributes to that bigger picture, not just, like I was saying, managers evaluating their team.
So how does that work in practice? I know the materials mention three main phases: performance planning, mid-year review, and year-end appraisal. Is it like a continuous cycle?
Exactly. Think of it as a continuous loop, constantly refining, adjusting, and it all starts with performance planning. That's where you work with your supervisor to set your individual work plan outputs for the year. But, and this is key, those outputs are directly linked to the larger operational management plan, which itself comes from the organization's strategic plan.
It's like a waterfall of goals, cascading from the top down.
Exactly. That's what makes it so powerful, right? Because it's easy to feel like you're just a small cog in a giant machine. But with SimSuite Pad, you can see exactly how your work, even if it feels small, directly impacts the organization's overall success.
I can see how that would be really motivating. Instead of just checking things off a list, you understand the why behind your work. Speaking of, one term I kept seeing in these materials, outputs, and they seem to differentiate between outputs and activities. Can you break that down a bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really crucial distinction. Outputs are the what, the results you deliver, right? Activities are the how, so the tasks you do to achieve those results.
So like if you were building a house, the finished house would be the output.
Exactly. The activities are all the individual steps to get there, laying the foundation, framing the walls, putting in the plumbing. SimSuite Pad, it's about focusing on that finished house, right? But also being mindful of the steps it takes to get there.
It's not enough to just go through the motions. You have to actually produce something. But it's not just about checking boxes and meeting deadlines either, is it? The materials also talk about something called competencies. What's that all about?
Right, right. It's much more holistic than just, as you said, ticking things off on a list. SimSuite Pad recognizes that achieving those outputs requires a specific set of skills and behaviors. These are what they're calling competencies.
So it's not just what you achieve, but how you achieve it. What kind of competencies are we talking about here?
Well, it varies depending on the role, of course, in the organization, but you can think of things like communication, problem solving, teamwork, leadership, those core skills, really, that are essential for success in any workplace.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me because it's not just about somebody's ability to complete the tasks. It's about developing them as a professional.
Exactly. By evaluating those competencies, SimSuite Pad encourages each individual to kind of figure out, okay, what are my strengths? Where can I grow? It's about continuous improvement.
And speaking of continuous improvement, CIMSuite PAD doesn't just rely on the supervisor's perspective, does it? There's this whole multi-rater feedback component that caught my eye.
That's right. And this is where you start to see that collaborative element really come into play. SimSuite Pad uses feedback from multiple sources, not just that direct supervisor.
Okay, so who else is providing feedback here? Colleagues? Clients? People outside the organization? Paint me a picture.
Well, it can vary, but essentially it's about gathering feedback from people who have directly worked with that staff member. So people who are either receiving their work outputs or observing, their behavior specifically related to those competencies.
So let's say, hypothetically, I'm being reviewed under this system. I'm getting feedback from my boss, maybe a few teammates, someone I collaborated with on a project. What happens with all that feedback? Do I get to see everything everyone said?
And that's where things get even more interesting. There's a distinction here between the feedback you receive on those work plan outputs and then the feedback on your competencies.
Oh, okay. Intrigued. Tell me more about this distinction.
So for the work plan outputs, that feedback is gathered from those colleagues you selected. but it's summarized by your supervisor before it's shared with you, so you don't see each individual comment, just kind of an overall summary.
Interesting. So there's a layer of interpretation there from the supervisor. What about the competency feedback?
Now, that's where things get a little different. That competency feedback, it's collected anonymously, actually, through the CIMSuite PAD system, and you actually get to see all of those comments directly.
Wow, that's pretty different from how most performance reviews work. I can definitely see how that level of transparency could be maybe a little nerve-wracking, but also incredibly valuable for someone's growth.
Exactly. It encourages, hopefully, a culture of open and honest feedback, right? Without that fear of, oh, if I say something, so-and-so is going to hold it against me.
Hmm.
And remember, all this feedback, it's supposed to be constructive, focused on development. This isn't about just, criticizing people.
So that does bring up a good point, though, right? How could this multifaceted feedback with both these summarized and anonymous components, how could that impact the team dynamic as a whole and each individual's growth? I feel like it could go either way. Either it promotes this really healthy environment of open communication support, or potentially it could create more distrust if it's not handled very carefully.
You're absolutely right, and it highlights the importance of implementation here. A system is only as good as the people using it, and SimSuite PAD is no exception. For it to really work, you need that foundation of trust, transparency, and a shared understanding of what the system is actually trying to achieve.
So it sounds like this whole system, SimSuite PAD, is really walking this line, right? Between, holding people accountable, making sure they're delivering, but then also that other side of it, fostering individual growth.
Exactly. And that's what makes it different, I think. It's not just about, okay, what went wrong? It's about, okay, what went wrong, but how can we, create a path forward so that you can actually grow from this experience? And that brings us to another important part of this whole system, these developmental outputs.
Right. There's a whole section in these materials about those, and these are different from the regular work plan outputs, correct?
They are. Think of developmental outputs as being specifically about your professional growth. So, developing some new skill, maybe expanding your knowledge in a certain area, getting some experience in a different department, for example, really pushing yourself beyond what you're currently doing.
So it's not just about what you did, but what you learned, how you grew throughout the year. Okay, I'm on board with that. But how does this actually work in practice? I mean, the materials mention that you're supposed to work with your supervisor to come up with like one or two of these developmental outputs, right? What would those actually look like?
Sure, yeah. So let's say you're in a marketing role, right? And you've decided, you know what, I really need to get better at data analysis. A very valuable skill to have these days, right? Your developmental output could be to, I don't know, maybe take a data analytics course and then actually apply what you learned to, a real world marketing campaign.
Okay, so it's very concrete, right? It's not just, I want to get better at data. It's, I'm going to take this course, I'm going to apply it to this project.
Exactly. And just like with those work plan outputs, you define very specific activities, performance indicators. That way you can actually track your progress. You can demonstrate what you've learned.
I really like how they defined it in the materials here. A developmental output is a particular skill, competency, or increased knowledge, which results from the completion of learning training or other developmental activities linked to the development plan. So, again, very tangible.
It is. And that's what's so exciting about SimSuite PAD, right? This whole idea of development, it's not just some afterthought, right? It's woven into the entire performance management process. So it's not just a once-a-year check-in where we talk about it and then forget about it. It's an ongoing thing, that cycle of planning, getting feedback, growing.
This is all very fascinating, but let's get down to brass tacks.
Yeah.
How does SimSuite PAD actually, assess performance? I mean, there's got to be some kind of rating system in place.
Of course. You're right. You can't really have a performance management system without some way to, evaluate progress, track how people are doing. And yeah, since we've had uses a rating scale, both for those work plan outputs and for competency, how well you're demonstrating those competencies.
Okay, so give me the details. What are the different ratings?
All right. So for the work plan outputs, it's pretty straightforward. You have did not achieve outputs, partially achieved outputs, fully achieved outputs, and then at the top, exceptional output achievement.
Makes sense. You either did it, partially did it, knocked it out of the park, or, well, you didn't quite get there. What about the competencies? Are those rated similarly?
Yeah, pretty similar. They use slightly different language, though. So instead of achieved, it's proficient. So you have not proficient, developing proficiency, fully proficient, and then, of course, exceptional proficiency.
So Whether we're talking about outputs or competencies, these ratings, they basically tell you where you fall on this spectrum of performance.
Yeah.
But I would imagine there are, very specific definitions for each of these ratings, right? Just to make sure everything is consistent, fair. Because, I mean, what one supervisor thinks is, exceptional, another might just think is fully achieved, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the materials do a really good job, I think, of providing those descriptions. So for each rating level, they outline very specifically, what distinguishes a partially achieved output, let's say, from a did not achieve output. So yeah, it helps to kind of eliminate some of that subjectivity.
That's good to know because, let's face it, performance reviews, they can feel a little bit like a black box sometimes. So the more transparency, the better, right?
Absolutely. That transparency, it builds trust in the system, which is crucial. When everyone understands, okay, this is what they're looking for, this is why I got this rating, it feels less like it's just, someone's arbitrary judgment.
And knowing those definitions, it's not just helpful for the managers, but really for everyone involved, right?
Exactly. The more you understand these ratings, the more you can actually, interpret your own performance reviews. You understand, okay, this is why I got this rating, and this is what I can do to improve.
It's about taking ownership. I like it. But even with all of that, this whole rating system, while obviously important, it kind of brings us back to, like, one of the potential downsides of performance reviews.
Mhm.
Even with clear definitions, there's always that risk of, I don't know, maybe some bias creeping in, misinterpretations, maybe just a mismatch in expectations.
You're right. You're right. And that's something that's really important to remember, I think. The success of any system, any performance management system, it doesn't just come down to the system itself. It's about how it's implemented, of course, but it's also about the organizational culture surrounding it.
Right, because you can have, like, the best hammer in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, you're not going to build a very good house.
Yeah.
So you could have this really well-designed system with all the best intentions, but if the culture around it is toxic, if it's all about placing blame or, micromanaging, it's not going to work.
Exactly. And I think CIMSuite PAD with, this focus on collaboration, on development, all that multi-rater feedback we talked about, it seems like it would work best in an environment, in an organizational culture that was already, more progressive, more growth-oriented.
A place where, like, getting feedback isn't a bad thing. It's not like you're being attacked. It's seen as, like, okay, this is how I can improve.
Exactly. It's a
Yeah.
gift.
A gift,
Yeah.
not something to be feared. And where development is encouraged, rewarded even.
Right, where it's not just lip service.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
we actually mean it. And those dreaded performance reviews, what if they were actually seen as opportunities to grow, not just like another box you had to check?
And that brings us to, kind of going back to something we talked about earlier, buy-in. For a system like CIMSuite PAD to really work, it can't just be, the management team saying this is what we're doing. It has to be embraced at every level.
Because let's be real, nobody likes it when something is just forced on them. It's just
Exactly.
like, oh, here's another hoop I have to jump through.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's why, making sure everyone understands it, transparency, communication, that's so important here. Everyone needs to know, okay, what is CIMSuite PAD? Why are we doing this? And what are we hoping to achieve?
And maybe even more importantly, how does this actually benefit me? Not just the company, not just my manager, but like, what's in it for me?
Right. When people understand that, oh, okay, this is actually going to help me grow professionally, it's going to help me develop skills, maybe even, move up in the organization, that's when they're going to, they're going to get on board.
So, CIMSuite PAD, it's not just a bunch of letters strung together, right?
Yeah.
This could be a whole different way of thinking about performance management. It's really making me think.
Me too. And when we look back at everything we've discussed, is there anything that really stands out to you? Anything that you find particularly impactful about this system?
I think for me, it goes back to that focus on development. So many systems out there, they're just stuck in that old way of doing things. It's all about, okay, what did you do wrong? But CIMSuite PAD, it feels different. It's about growth. It's about feedback. It's about connecting what you do every day with the bigger picture. And to me, that's exciting. That's where you see real change happen, not just for the company, but for the individual.
I completely agree. It really feels like, moving away from those dreaded performance reviews and moving towards something, well, more holistic, more human.
Definitely. It makes you wonder, though, if you were developing a system like this, wouldn't you want to get input from the people who are actually going to be evaluated?
Hmm.
That wasn't really addressed in any of these materials.
That's such a good point. And it's something for everyone listening to consider. Could something like CIMSuite PAD ever be truly successful without that buy-in from the people it's meant to help. I think that's something worth thinking about.
It definitely is. And that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But this conversation has given us a lot to chew on. So to our listeners, we want to hear from you. Head over to our website, leave a comment, tell us what you think about CIMSuite PAD. Would it work in your organization?